Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to the fourth session on the third day of the 18th Vermont Organics Recycling Summit. I'm Natasha Duarte, the director of the Composting Association of Vermont, and we organize the summit most years, almost every year, in partnership with the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources. This year's summit is being held as a kickoff event for International Compost Awareness Week, which starts this coming Sunday, and it's the largest and most comprehensive education initiative of the compost industry. The theme this year is Compost Nature's Climate Champion, and I'm just going to draw people's attention to this poster on the right here. This is by a student from the University of Vermont who is part of Dr. Debner's Composting Ecology and Management class. Every year they take the International Compost Awareness theme, and the students are challenged to make up their own versions of the poster for it, which I like to highlight a different one for every session. If for those of you who joined us in person on Monday, most of them were displayed in person, physical posters, which was fun. But if you missed that, or if you want to check them out in more detail, we have a gallery of them on our website at compostingvermont.org/VORS. That's VORS. And then just because not everybody figures this out, if you click on the image, it'll actually bring up the student's name and a little story that they provided about their inspiration for making their poster and their interpretation of the theme this year. And so that's just been a really fun partnership that we've had going for a number of years now. Just a few more things I want to go through before we start this evening's session. I want to give a huge thanks to all of our sponsors and exhibitors. They're the ones who allow us to provide this full virtual program to you all free of charge. And so without their help and support, we certainly wouldn't be able to have this freely available program that hopefully lowers any potential barrier for participation, and then that also supports the time and effort that it takes to get all of these recordings up and shared with everybody after the summit is over. And so this is a recorded session. So if there are things that you want to come back and listen to again, or aren't clear on, or if you want to share it as a resource, you'll be able to do that as well. This year, our sponsors include Community Bank, Eco Products, Addison County Solid Waste Management District, AgriLab Technologies, Casella, Food Cycler, Nature Cycle, Vermont Natural Ag Products, Viably, CV Compost, the Vermont Produce Program with the Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, and Woods End Laboratories. So again, just much appreciation. Many of these folks are perennial sponsors of this event, and we really rely on their support. While I introduce the session, I'm going to invite Shannon, our presenter, to share hers. This is the Mastering the Art of Backyard Composting with Expert Tips for Residents and Trainers. Shannon Choquette started her career in materials management as outreach coordinator with the Northeast Kingdom Waste Management District. Now with the Department of Environmental Conservation Solid Waste Program, she has extensive experience offering in-person and virtual backyard composting workshops to Vermonters. And so we're really excited to have this special midweek evening session to really invite all of you who might be trainers, but also just folks who are living in Vermont and wondering how to do a better job composting in your own space. This is just such a great opportunity for us to provide this type of targeted piece of the program for you all. And so with that, Shannon, please take it away.
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you, Natasha, for this opportunity to be here, on a Wednesday evening. I'm glad that I get to join you all from the comfort of your own home and talk about mastering the art of backyard composting. And I say with expert tips for residents and trainers, but I recognize that I by no means would consider myself an expert, and that a lot of the knowledge that I know about backyard composting has been, gleaned from conversations that I've had with Vermonters about their experience with that backyard composting. And so I just want to recognize that, while I've certainly dug my hand into a lot of piles in the past, there's such a value in just talking about what you're experiencing and, you know, just having those conversations and increasing your knowledge that way. And that's certainly how I have learned a lot of what I'm going to share with you this evening. And so, just as a quick agenda, so we're just going to quickly go over the goals of the presentation, talk a little bit about Vermont state law and, Vermont state waste composition. We're going to talk about food waste and its connection to climate change, a little bit about ways to reduce food waste and the benefits of backyard composting. And this will all lead into the chunk of our conversation, which is, backyard composting basics, like collecting our compost ingredients, what is the compost recipe, where we choose to build our compost, what style of bin we should choose, how we build and maintain the pile, how that might relate to hot versus cold composting, troubleshooting and what to do if things go wrong, and then some emerging issues. And so one thing I'd like to say here is if you have questions, you can certainly put them in the chat, but I would recommend waiting until closer to the end of the workshop because, I might address your questions throughout it. Yeah, which I hope I do. And so my goals as I was putting this together for you all were to just gain some knowledge of some basic concepts, right? That's easy enough to say. But what I'm really looking to do is increase your confidence with experimenting with a backyard compost. Or that could include teaching about compost, increasing your confidence, going out into your community and talking with others about it. And I want to emphasize that backyard composting in a lot of ways is an experiment. We have certain inputs, we can change certain parts of how we build a compost, and we're going to get different results. And so for me, I actually think that helps me think about it a little bit more critically, and not, know that like if something goes wrong, then I can just change something about it. And again, I'm hoping to provide you with the information and the knowledge that you need to look at your compost, have some sense of what's going on and what might need to be adjusted. And I wanted to share quickly that, we recognize that there are a lot of Vermonters, both residents and businesses, that, believe that it is important to keep food scraps out of the trash. And we know this from a previous Vermonter poll. I believe this was the 2020 Vermonter poll. But within that poll, it also addressed what information and what assistance people need to make it easier to comply with the food scrap ban. And so, I just want to point out that we recognize that people feel like it's important that they have information on how to compost correctly, how to do it in the winter, how to keep fruit flies out of the way. I won't talk much about financial assistance because we on the state level don't offer that, but a lot of solid waste districts do offer discounted compost bins, and I will touch upon that. But yeah, what materials to purchase, how to use it as animal feed, all of these things are just a big part of the puzzle of what people feel like they need in order to be able to keep their food scraps out of the trash. And so also really quickly, just coming back to how I wanted to use this workshop also as a way to just discuss how we can talk about this topic to a variety of audiences. And so I'm not a trained educator. I've done a lot of environmental education in my days. That phrase sounds a little old, I don't know, but you know what I'm saying. I'm not a formal educator. And so these are just tips that I felt like have helped me with this particular topic. And the first thing, no matter what age, is to remind our audience of what they already know. Because typically with composting, we understand that there's a connection to decomposition. You know how things rot, the leaves in the forest at some point won't be there anymore. You know, we don't have like years and decades worth of leaves just building up because they break down. And so even at a young age, we have this concept. And so we can start with that concept of our observation of the natural world, and we can build upon those key concepts to fill in some of those knowledge gaps. And we can do this in a way that uses plain language as much as possible. And while I feel like I'm still working on this, the what's mostly, I feel like that's like talking at like a eighth grade vocabulary is sort of what that implies. That, you know, anyone of, you know, most educational backgrounds would be able to just like understand the general words that you're using. And that sounds easy, but can actually be really important. So quickly, going to talk about Vermont's universal recycling and composting law. Maybe you've heard of this in the past. And that is the law that says that all food scraps are banned from landfill disposal in Vermont. And so our food scraps mean our parts of the food that we don't typically eat, you know, things that I would consider unavoidable food waste, like we don't typically eat banana peels, eggshells, cores, pits, things like that. You know, the parts of food that we forget to eat, like our leftovers, the more avoidable food scraps, also are banned from the trash. And then things like coffee grounds and filters, and also meat and bones. However, because you should not throw those into a backyard compost, and I'll discuss why in a little bit. Those should not go into your compost, and so you can, if you can bring them to a local drop off, or if you choose not to do that, you can toss those in the trash. But most communities do have collections for meat and bones if you choose not to incorporate those into your backyard compost. And in Vermont, we really do try to prioritize, you know, wasting less food scraps to begin with. In our messaging, we really try to focus on how to store food properly, purchase the right amount, just to waste less, recognizing that that is how we can make the most change. We want to feed people as much as possible, and aside from donating some canned goods you may have, that more so applies to like larger establishments, like retail establishments, and how we promote food donation across the state. And then feeding animals, like I mentioned, if you have backyard chickens, obviously it's great to feed your food scraps to the chickens and then maybe compost what they don't want to eat. You know, you don't want to forget about them. But also if you have a pig, they're obviously you're going to be feeding them your food scraps before tossing them into a backyard compost. And then composting and anaerobically digesting our food scraps. While on this hierarchy, we call it least preferred. You know, that is not, you know, it is not least preferred by any means. We recognize that when people choose to compost and take the effort to do that, that goes a really long way, you know, towards the state reaching our waste reduction goals. And so just a little snip of our waste stream in Vermont. You know, food waste, it's in Vermont's landfill. It's coming from some Vermont homes. I say that because I recognize that a lot of people in this audience are not tossing food scraps into the trash. And we do have almost our Vermont, our pie chart waste composition from 2023, but the information I have here is from 2018. And so this was before the food scrap ban went into effect for for smaller businesses and all residents. It had gone into effect for some very large businesses by this point. But in 2018, what we saw was that between food waste and other organic materials like pet waste, leaf and yard waste, that roughly a quarter of our landfill was material that could definitely be composted. And then paper also is a good portion that is organic material and could be potentially composted. Not all paper streams, I understand, are suitable for that, but we have a good portion, right here that is from organic materials, and we have an opportunity to capture that and, have our pie chart be filled up with all of this stuff that is, more suitable for landfill disposal. And of course, we can think about other ways to manage construction and demolition material and furniture, and we should. But that food waste, that seems like one of the most important things to capture, and I'll explain why in a second. But food waste by sector, and this isn't Vermont specific information, this is nationwide. And I didn't read this study fully to see where they got this information, how they determine this. But from studies, we can see that over a third of the food waste, the food scraps that end up in the landfill are generated by residents. And so, of course, our food service, our retail, manufacturing, and farms is going to make a large portion of that as well. But we can certainly tackle this 37% here. And so this is just to put into context with different types of circles, really, that food waste in our landfills does exist. And it exists in our homes. And if you've taken measures in your own homes to keep it all out, then this, is not because of you, but it is still a trend that we see. Although I will say for the 2023 studies, the pie chart might look a little different. We'll have those results soon. And so this food waste that's in our landfill from some of our homes, it's actually really expensive. And this number of $1,500 a year for the average family, like the average family, I think is like 4.2 people, because some are bigger than 4, some are less. But, I think to myself, like, how much money do I really spend on food that I end up composting? And when I start to think about it, I'm like, oh, maybe I shouldn't think about it, because then I start to feel bad about myself, because I realize that I need to put my money where my mouth is, and I need to fix certain things about how I shop to make sure I don't create food waste. And this number has been what I've heard for years and years now. I wonder if it's increased with the increased cost of living. So we know food waste is expensive. And not only that, but we know food waste has a lot of impact for climate change. And I just think that this is so important to emphasize when I talk to people about composting. And in the beginning, when I used to do these workshops, like years ago, when I was with the Northeast Kingdom Waste Management District, I didn't understand this connection as much. And so I didn't drive this home as much. But there's been so much research over the past few years, and we can really see that not only are landfills a very large emitter of methane, which methane is a very powerful greenhouse gas. It's more potent than carbon dioxide, but it has a shorter life in our environment. But even so, even though it has a shorter, I think it's half life. Not the best at the chemistry stuff, but I don't even know if that's chemistry. But what I'm trying to say is, I think growing up when I was younger and when I was in school studying this, I heard about carbon dioxide. You hear about that as the greenhouse gas. That is, what we sort of gauge other greenhouse gases against. And so when we talk about methane, we say it's 23 times more potent than carbon dioxide. But interestingly, when methane is first emitted, it's far more powerful. It's about 72 times more potent of a greenhouse gas than carbon dioxide. As it breaks down in our atmosphere, it ends up becoming closer to 23. And then the expectation is that methane over like 100 or 200 years doesn't have as much greenhouse gas potential. Whereas carbon dioxide will remain in our environment, our atmosphere for like 1,000 years or so. And so I just mentioned that to compare, with methane sometimes, oh, it's this powerful, and it's true for both depending on how long the methane has been in our environment. But anyway, so in this pie chart, we can see that, natural gas and petroleum systems, so our transportation, other petroleum systems we have in our country, that does create the largest amount of methane. Then we have livestock, and so typically cows produce a lot of methane as well. And then we have landfills as the third largest emitter. And the EPA recently created this colorful image to inform us that, out of that 15%, they estimate that our wasted food causes 58% of that methane generation. And so if I had spent a little bit of time, I could have done that math to see how much of this total pie could be, associated to the food waste that goes in our landfill. And so again, if we know that food scraps are generated in our homes at the extent that they are, and they're ending up in landfills at the extent that they are, and then they're producing this methane, it all leads back to, well, what can we do, right? And this picture, I just like to point out, I use this in a lot of my, when I did do more education, when I was with a waste district in the Northeast Kingdom, whenever I went into schools, I would show this picture, which is an image that was taken during like a university class. They went out to do like an archaeological dig, a modern day archaeological dig at a landfill. And so this professor, Dr. William Rothg, I might be butchering his name, unfortunately, but he was like sort of like the king of garbology back in the day. And he spent his life's work understanding how landfills work and how, what we can find out about human society from landfills. And through his work, we started to understand that food scraps do not break down in landfill atmospheres like we might think that they do, right? And so this carrot was conveniently found in a bag next to a newspaper that was still readable, still had the date on it. And so, what I love about this picture, especially when I go into like 4th and 5th grade classes, and I ask them, how long do you think these carrots were in the landfill? And they start to say like a week or a year. And it's like, oh no, it's actually as long as you've been alive. It's 10 years that they were in the landfill. And so we can see from this image that decomposition starts, right? It starts to break down, but something is missing from the landfill that these carrots could not fully break down like you would expect them to. And I mean, just as a little thing I'll mention here, it's oxygen that is missing because oxygen is necessary for decomposition. But again, I think this image just does a good job driving home the reality of our food scraps when they get entombed within a landfill. And so composting also combats the climate crisis through building our soil health. And oops, I don't know if my screen just went. Sorry, I work with a monitor. Hopefully that, okay, there you go.
You're good. You're good.
Did it just go black for a second?
No.
Okay, good, great, because it did on my end. So, and there are so many more people who can speak to how compost builds soil health a lot better. Starting to learn the extent of this, but we know that soil stores carbon. It can sequester carbon because of the organic matter within healthy soils. And we know that when we amend 1 acre of soil with compost, it can sequester up to 75% of a car's annual emissions. And this information is all from the Institute of Local Self-Reliance. And so, in building up that soil, in adding organic material, in improving the ability of the soil to hold moisture, we improve plant growth, we improve root growth, which is really important. I mean, of course, plant growth is important, but it's the growth underground that really will help to aerate the soil, sequester more carbon, retain nutrients. Um, and that all builds up resilience, not just within the soil but also within our communities, as we think about how we'll have to combat the climate crisis in a variety of ways in the coming years. And certainly, like I said, there are so many people who can speak far more to this aspect than I can, so this just touches upon the surface of it. And then, obviously, I think it should be noted that we can't talk about composting food scraps without spending a little time talking about, wasting less. Again, not just because of how much it costs and the environment, but just because we live such a fast-paced life. I'm realizing for myself that these like tips and tricks are actually making a difference. And so I've started writing a shopping list. It sounds like the easiest thing in the world, but again, trying to put my money where my mouth is. And um, I had to walk back out to my car because I forgot the shopping list in my car last week, but I was like, I'm gonna get it, And so even things like that, we're just moving at such a fast pace. That remembering to stay in control when we shop, also very important, goes a long way. Um, Storing our food properly after we shop. That's something I think avocados are a great example of. I purchased some, they got almost to where they were good. I had too many of them, so I was like, I need to put them in the fridge right now. And then they lasted a few days. And I thought, me, I did it. I actually ate these things when they were still good. But it's celebrating those small wins. Learning how to eat every morsel of the food to have less waste. My coworker, Alyssa, has a recipe for a cauliflower soup that she puts all the leaves in. And she said her kids love it, even though it's like an interesting gray color. And that's just one example. But also remembering to love your leftovers and actually, eat the food that you've already put the effort into cooking and buying, and all those resources are there. And yeah, again, it takes a little bit of extra thought. I had some leftover roasted vegetables the other day, and I was like, I'm gonna make a frittata. And again, I felt like the most responsible adult in the moment, where I was like, yes, I'm remembering to do this. And the frittata was so good. And so it's those small wins. And I just want to point out that while I can't talk too much about reducing food waste here, we do have a Vermont food scrap challenge that we'll be offering in September of 2024, with a focus on saving money, preventing food waste, and just talking about all the different things, how you remember to shop with a list, what you should put on your list, how you portion things out, meal planning, just all those little things that go a long way. Because we all have to eat food every single day. And so that leads me into the conversation about backyard composting now, because, like I said, we've talked a little bit about the benefits of it environmentally, financially, talked about state law, and which I'm very grateful for, because I feel like it's why I have a job, because it is the law that we compost. Well, now that we keep food scraps out of the trash. And backyard composting is one option for that. But before we dive into this conversation, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page for what I'm talking about when I talk about compost. Because, we can talk about compost as the finished product, like I think of that like as a noun, like I'm holding compost, it's in my hands, and then we can talk about composting as the process of it. And that's really what we're focusing on today. I mean, obviously, both of it, we're focusing on the process of composting. And so the definition of composting is it is the aerobic decomposition. So again, making a connection between what decomposition is and composting. This is where I start to do that. So composting is the aerobic decomposition that transforms organic waste into a nutrient-rich soil amendment. That's a little wordy. That's hopefully like the most jargony thing I'll say this evening. You know, when I say like soil amendment, we don't call it a fertilizer in this field. It's like something you add to the soil, you amend the soil with it. And we want to emphasize that it's nutrient rich. But really, the most important thing in this definition is the word aerobic, which means that in this decomposition process, that oxygen is involved. There is fresh air. And when we compost, we're essentially trying to control decomposition to get optimal results. And when I say control decomposition, like what do I mean? I mean by taking only certain composting ingredients, thinking about our recipe, building our pile size a certain way, how we build the compost pile, how we maintain it. All of those things are how we control decomposition within our compost. And so by controlling decomposition, our goals are to speed up the decomposition process, to help reduce odors. And really, so we're trying to make it more efficient, more effective. And we're accomplishing this by really giving our decomposers the best environment that you possibly can to thrive. You're really trying to build like a little decomposer hotel. And this is sometimes where, especially with a younger audience, I try to make the connection to, what do we all need to survive? We need food, air, water, shelter. And so in your compost, that's really what you're thinking about, is how you build up everything that they need so that your decomposers, your bacteria, the different types of fungi, and your worms and insects, so that they want to be in your compost, they'll thrive in your compost, and they'll just take care of all the decomposition as quickly as possible with minimal nuisance and odors. And so now that we understand sort of, that composting is different than decomposition, we're going to sort of dive into our composting ingredients. And again, we'll talk about ingredients and then about recipe. And I know a lot of people have a lot of questions about composting ingredients specifically. And so I'll try to, put more information in than what's on these slides. But when we think about composting, oftentimes we think about our food scraps because we have such an emphasis on keeping food scraps out of the trash, and backyard composting involving food scraps. You just hear about that. There have been many times people have asked me why their compost isn't working. And when I ask them what they put in other than food scraps, they'll say coffee grounds. But coffee grounds is actually in the category of food scraps. And so right there, that might tell me that they don't have the right ingredients and the right recipe. But they had it in their mind that, you compost your kitchen waste in your backyard, but then we're missing some other really crucial pieces of information. And so when we think about what we can compost for food scraps, it's really a lot of the fruit and veggie stuff, your egg shells, tea bags, moldy breads, coffee, the nuts, the grains. And then you can compost also some plate scrapings. I recognize that some information online, some plate, don't put in salad that's had dressing on it. I've never had any issue with that. Personally, I haven't heard anyone have an issue with it. And so I think that is not an issue if the food is cooked. It doesn't need to be just raw food. You can have like, if you have like steamed veggies that you didn't eat, like cooked food can go into your compost as well. And you can even into a mature and active compost pile, put in small amounts of dairy leftover food, like the pizza crust with a little bit of cheese, and oils and fats, very limited amounts. And again, this would be into like a compost that's already active and has a lot of microbial stuff going on. And I'll tell you how you might be able to know that. But you don't want to put in meat, you don't want to put in fish or bones, you know, obviously, or maybe not obviously, I don't know. These materials are decomposable. They can break down, but they will produce odors. Animals will seek out your compost pile for these items. And so that's really just in recognizing that we don't want your compost piles to be actively inviting wildlife. Um, and I've heard a lot of people in the past say that the way that they manage their food scraps is walking out to the edge of their field and just throwing it in the woods. And it's like, no, you really shouldn't. I mean, you just shouldn't be actively feeding wildlife, for a multitude of reasons. Um, and while I've met so many people who have a compost pile that was well managed and really effective, and they did compost meat, bones, and fish in their pile, for the beginner composter, they should truly just be left out. Especially if your compost pile doesn't reach really decent sizes, like 3 feet tall, 3 feet wide. That's sort of the threshold for where maybe you could start to add minimal amounts of this. And I'll explain that difference between hot and cold composting too. But our food scraps, they're really, we call them the greens, and they are providing nitrogen to our decomposers. And they also provide moisture to our compost pile because they are majority moisture. Our food scraps are like 85% water. So yeah, really important for balancing moisture and giving that nitrogen to our decomposers. And when we think about, how to collect food scraps, a lot of questions that we'll receive, like, are people asking about fruit flies? And certainly there are ways to manage fruit flies with traps, but the best way to manage fruit flies or any nuisances, is stopping those odors before they begin. And so whether or not you use something like a reused food container, if you got a soup from a restaurant to take home, that's a typical version of that. I'm thinking like miso soup because I love that. Or a store-bought container, what you're looking for is a tight fitting lid. And so, again, a great option here and here. Another good reuse option is a coffee container. When you're in the store, when you open a plastic coffee tub, and even if it doesn't have the seal, when you close it, you can't smell it. I started that sentence wrong. You can only smell it when you open it. And so something with a tight fitting lid, is really the goal. And you want to choose a design that is either easy to clean or easy to rinse out and recycle if you're done using it, like the coffee one. Or if it's a reusable one that you bought and you want to just use as long as you can, you do want to be able to clean it. And you want, the container to be large enough that you can collect food scraps for maybe a few days. That really will depend on your personal comfort, whether or not you have it on the counter or you keep your food scraps in the fridge. Again, that's another, benefit for using a smaller container. But you want to add your food scraps either to your compost pile or to maybe like a 5-gallon bucket you have in a climate controlled part of your house, like a garage. You want to do that every few days to keep odors down. And optionally, you can store your food scraps in your fridge or your freezer. My cat is coming. Hopefully she doesn't do that too many times. But, especially when it comes to odors, fruit flies. If you have the space for storing your food scraps in the fridge, that's a great option. Um, if you are looking to collect food scraps throughout the winter and not continue composting, storing them in the freezer, if you have space, again, a great option, just for mitigating odor. And then if you do collect them over the winter, then you'll have enough material in the spring to start a new pile, which I'll talk about a little bit as well. So again, we have our food scraps. We have some idea of what we should collect in our kitchen. And now we're focusing a little bit more to outside, to around our property, thinking about what leaf and yard waste and other brown material we should be collecting. These materials are super, super important for our compost. And I like to think that our compost pile is mostly these materials, because these materials are what provide carbon to our decomposer, which is their main energy source. It's like what they eat that gives them their fuel. And then the nitrogen from the food scraps is important for building enzymes and proteins. But it's really this carbon material that's going to keep them going. And so when I say carbon materials, browns, I'm talking our dried leaves, our hay, mulch hay, straw, wood chips, wood shavings, shredded paper, also a good option. Although I have heard instances of people using a lot of shredded paper and it can become sort of compressed. And that being said, with browns, the more variety you get, the better, because these materials are going to promote airflow. They're going to balance moisture in the compost pile. And so if you think about it, a wood chip adds a lot more space to a compost pile than a piece of sawdust. A wood chip you'd have to sift out in the end because it doesn't break down as quick. But they offer slightly different things when it comes to air and moisture flow. And so I always say, if you can mix up your browns throughout the year, that goes a long way with really helping to keep that moisture flowing. And so now we're going to dive a little bit into the compost recipe. And before I go into this, I'll say, when I first thought about learning about compost, and I laugh sometimes when I think of this, but I was an undergrad and I remember someone talking to me about like a project they were doing about compost. And I just thought, I don't understand organic chemistry. Like, I don't even want to think about that. I was just, I think, overwhelmed with the project that I was working on for one of my classes. But I just remember thinking, I don't want to think about composting food scraps. And it was really this 30-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio, hearing that really just turned me off to the idea of learning more. And so I want to break this down. And this is where, when we're teaching about compost, we can find information online ourselves, and it can really lead us in weird directions, right? Like you can hear 30-to-1 carbon nitrogen and be like, what does that even mean? You can start to look up specific ratios for certain items, and it's like, that's not what helps us apply our knowledge of what we should be doing. And so we can talk about it in like a biological, like 30-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio, or we can talk about it in like an applied science type of way. Like, what knowledge do I need to know to actually use these concepts in my everyday life? And so I never really like to talk about the 30-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio. I'm more focused on that for every 1 part of green material, and so for every 1 gallon of food scraps, you want 3 times the amount of brown material. And this is why I said, like, essentially our compost pile is brown material. Like when we think about backyard composting, our mind might go to food scraps, but those browns are really what is building the majority of the volume of your backyard compost. And for some, can be a barrier for backyard composting if you don't feel like you're going to have access to that much brown material. If you live in a place where maybe you don't have that many trees. Like, I mean, I remember there was like at least twice up in the Northeast Kingdom that I was driving down the street and there was like a bale of hay that fell off of someone's truck and I pulled over and put it in my trunk and I was because those carbons, I would only do that where it's safe. Like, don't do that where it's not safe, please. But like, um, I saw the opportunity to get that carbon material and I absolutely went for it. Because I realized that person's not going to come back for that one bale of hay. I thought maybe they would for a second, but and so, when we think again about what's the carbon nitrogen ratio of all my different ingredients, I don't even want you to worry about that. And that's why, like, I didn't even let you really read this slide because what I want you to remember is that for every 1 part green material, you get that 3 parts brown. And you can have a variety of different recipes to make this happen, but that is your ultimate goal. And so here, this graphic is slightly altered just to change the color of the buckets. But this was from a Highfield Center for Composting informational packet about backyard composting. And so you can see, again, different varieties of every 1 part of green. We have 3 parts of brown, which could be the leaves, the sawdust, the chips, the mulch, hay, shredded paper. It also could be horse manure. I don't emphasize that very much because not many people have access to it. If you put into your backyard compost for a variety of reasons, it has all the bacteria that will kickstart the backyard composting process. It's so nutrient rich and porous at the same time, and it's just great stuff. But you can certainly make a quality material without manures. And just again, trying to focus on that variety of brown material as much as you can. And so this 1 part green to 3 part brown ratio, not only are you giving that your compost microorganisms, the decomposers, not only does that give them the 30-to-1 carbon nitrogen ratio, but it also promotes compost porosity, which is what's going to help with that airflow and our moisture flow through the pile. And so when you have a really wet and, like food scraps are really wet when they start to break down, a really wet and heavy nitrogen ingredient. And then you have some bulking materials, maybe like those wood chips, some bigger objects like wood shavings, and then you have different carbon amendments. And this is really just to show how it all builds together. You really could have you don't need to have what they call a bulking agent. That's really for larger compost systems like a windrow where you really want to try to promote airflow. But this graphic is really just to show when we take those different components and we mix them together, we're really promoting that air and moisture flow. And again, this 1 part green and 3 part brown, it ensures that we have an adequate pile size. Again, there were a few times when people would ask me why their compost wasn't working. And after our conversation, I started to get the sense that their compost pile was really tiny, just like super tiny. When we are thinking about trying to promote a good environment for our microorganisms, those decomposers, they are most active in the center of the compost pile. And so here in this diagram, we can see that the temperature, which indicates how active the microorganisms are, because as they're consuming the food waste, they generate heat. And so most of that biological activity is going to be within the center of the compost pile, and then the temperature will cool towards the outside. And so the larger the pile, if you're following this ratio of ingredients, the hotter it will be able to get because there's so much more of microorganism activity in there. And as the microorganisms generate heat, they will promote natural air circulation in the compost pile as well. And so, if you go to your compost and you feel a slight warmth rising from it, that air is like a convection current is flowing through there. And that heat tells you that the compost is active. You would expect that the further into the compost pile you dug, the warmer it would get. And that's all signs that it's all going well. And so, we've talked a little bit about compost ingredients and recipe and the importance of carbon and nitrogen. So now we're going to sort of switch gears and talk about where you should think about building a compost. There we go. So you can really build a compost in any location that is convenient. It is so much on personal preference. I think the key thing you're looking for is that it is on a well-drained soil area. You don't want to put it in a place where you get seasonal flooding. You don't want to put it in a place where you have very clay-rich soil that doesn't drain. And so think about the property that you have and the characteristics of, the spots that you have available, and try to focus on a place that has some permeable soil. Permeable meaning it can drain very well. It can be in the sun or in the shade. I've heard people say different preferences. If your compost pile is in the direct sun, you just want to make sure that the moisture doesn't dry out of it during the summer. You may need to water it a little bit more, but that's also personal preference. I think, certainly benefits of keeping it in the shade so that it doesn't dry out. You do want to be able to have access to water in case it does, need a boost of moisture, and especially when you're first building the pile, you will want to add additional water. And then thinking about the proximity to your house, looking out the window at your beautiful compost pile. But this one actually, I think, is really important. And I know from personal experience, I had to help my mother rebuild a compost pile that, her husband had spinal surgery. She didn't have access to it as much, and she was just like collecting her food scraps for a while. And I realized the importance of having a convenient and accessible compost. If it's your goal to keep food scraps out of the trash, throughout all the seasons of your life, you might not want to have it an acre away from your house. I didn't convince her to move it closer to the house, though, I will say that. But thankfully, they're in better health now. So again, where you put your compost pile is certainly personal preference, and as is the compost bin style that you choose. Traditional bins, I think there are so many designs out there that you can make your own or purchase at the stores. I've always loved the traditional soil saver, but I am partial to that because a lot of the waste districts and solid waste management entities in the state offer these, or have in the past, at a discounted rate. And they're just so durable. They have a lid open on the bottom. They allow for that airflow. They have a great capacity. They're about 90 something gallons. And so perfect for a family of 4. All these things that you want to consider when you're thinking about how much, like what size and what you're really looking for. These designs are stationary on the ground. And so you do want to consider having a design that has some ease of maintenance. If you need to have a pallet design and actually move a pallet to be able to mix things up, that might seem a little bit cumbersome, but maybe not. And so just all things to consider with store-bought and homemade stationary bins. Compost tumblers are popular. I think, I've gotten so many questions about them over the years, and I've received a lot of interesting feedback about them as well. They're lifted off the ground so they can be animal resistant. Um, they can also, sometimes inhibit airflow. So you might need to like add some additional poles, but I have a slide about them specifically in a little bit. And then just a do-it-yourself wire bin is really great for leaf in yard waste, but designs like this can also incorporate food scraps. You really just want to consider having an animal resistant design. And so, again, considerations for any design, keeping animals away, number one. I'll go in a little bit more on that. What's your goal of composting? Is it gardening? Is it waste management? That might help you determine how much effort you put into producing a finished product. Because if you want it for your garden, you're gonna put more energy and effort into it if you're just doing it for keeping food scraps out of the trash. Again, store-bought or homemade, capacity and thinking about how much food waste you create. Um, and so like a pallet system might be good for some people, but it might actually be very large for a family of, just a few people. Um, because it can take a while to fill up. Um, that being said, they are a great size when you do get them filled up because it will generate heat because there's just so much material in there. You want to think about moisture and airflow again, the difference between a stationary bin that will allow air and moisture flow from the bottom and one that is lifted off the ground that will inhibit that, and ease of maintenance. Um, with tumbler, you might think that there is some ease of maintenance, but I've heard they can get very heavy and hard to turn. And so you will have to consider how often to empty it out, so that you have the ability to actually turn it. So quickly, just some methods to turn animals. We recommend putting hardware cloth around and reinforcing sides of homemade bins. Hardware cloth is different from chicken wire, but I think of it similarly. But it's a thicker gauge, smaller squares, and animals can't eat through it and they can't get through it. You can soak rags in ammonia, which can be left in buckets near compost, or I've heard of taking like a little piece of PVC pipe and shoving an ammonia soaked rag in there. That will certainly deter animals. It's such a strong scent. And that I've heard that you can keep the rag in there for like a week or two before that scent is completely gone. Um, and then electric fencing is also a way to secure a compost pile. And if you have other attractants such as beehives, an investment such as that might go a long way, for keeping just everything out of the bear's reach. And so now we're going to dive into actually building a compost pile, thanks to this nice AI generated graphic that I made on Canva, which I've discovered is so awesome. But you want to first, so we found our location, we figured out our bin style, we built our bin on top of hardware cloth, and so no burrowing animals can get into there. We want to, prepare the location by mowing with grass, removing leaves and other debris. Yeah, like I mentioned, putting down that hardware cloth. And then our first layer is going to be on top of that hardware cloth, and it's going to be a pretty hefty layer of browns. And so I think, and I always advise that that first layer of browns is like thicker than maybe your other layers because it will compress over time and it's going to be really important for helping that airflow. But you want to put a good solid layer of leaf and yard waste at the bottom. And you do not want to put food scraps directly on the ground. That will be an invitation for burrowing animals to like come up in there and try to eat it. So on top of those browns, then we can start to incorporate and layer our first layer of greens. And so our food scrap layer should never be more than 6 inches tall, which I mean, I don't know how you would actually ever do that. It's a pretty thick layer of food waste. You have to have a lot of it. But I always advise trying to make your layer of food scraps like a single layer and keep it as much in the center as much as possible. And that for every 1 gallon of greens, you're going to cover it with 3 gallons of browns. And you're going to continue layering your compost pile when you build that initial pile with that 1 to 3 ratio until you get something that is whole, because it will start to decompress, to compress pretty quick as material breaks down and everything settles. And so you want to start off with a good amount of material to get the microbial populations going. And again, you always want to cover your green with a brown layer. You never want to leave food scraps visible on the top of the compost. That's just like an invitation for animals to come in and eat it. And those browns will help deter any odors or mitigate any odors. And so when you finish adding in all your initial ingredients, you do want to add water to the compost. And this water is in the beginning is really important for providing moisture to the pile before any of the food scraps really start to break down. Once the food scraps start to break down, you may not need to add much water if we're in our regular summer season where we get a lot of rain and your pile gets rain, that might be all that you need. Um, but in the beginning, you definitely want to add water. And then we'll talk about maintenance as well, where you may want to add water if you find your pile is dry. And then you want to cover your bin with a lid if possible, just again, recognizing that we want to keep animals away from this as much as possible. And I didn't have a bin in my little AI generated picture here, but I mean a lid, but there's a lid on there. It's just imaginary. And so there are a few different things to consider when you're using a tumbler. A lot of things are similar, like you want to use the same 1 to 3 greens to browns ratio. You may need to drill extra holes for airflow. And you really definitely want to use a variety of brown material in a tumbler because they can get really wet and really heavy. And so having larger brown stuff, not really large, but but you want that airflow, and you might feel the need to add a little bit extra browns to really soak up some of that extra moisture. You want to turn your tumbler periodically, but not too often. And so I talked to a woman once who told me that she was turning her tumbler every day. And so when we think about a stationary compost pile on the ground, and we think about how most of the microorganisms, all the bacteria, they're in the center of the pile, and that's where they're generating heat. When we turn that pile, we release that heat, we release the energy, we disturb the population of the microorganisms. They're still there, but it'll take them a while to, sort of get back up to pace with generating heat that they did. They need to rebuild their populations. And that's the same thing in a tumbler. When the material is just in the tumbler hanging out, it'll be the center of the tumbler where there's the most active decomposition. And every time you turn it, you're going to disturb that a little bit. And it will take, not necessarily, it won't take long, but it'll take a second for the activity to get to that same point. And so you want to also empty out the tumbler before it becomes too heavy. If you have material that is essentially pre-composted, like you can still see some food scraps, it's actually pretty great because it almost can like pre-compost the material. Then by the time it gets full and then you're able to empty it out, you can set it to the side, allow it to finish composting. And at that point, it'll be a little less attractive to animals. And so if you use a tumbler, even if it's small, it's a great way to sort of keep that material away from animals and closed for the very beginning portions of the decomposition, and then remove it when necessary and allow it to finish on the side. Yeah. So now maintaining our compost pile, because again, we've talked about the recipe, the ingredients, how we build up our pile. And now thinking about what do we do next? And so every time we have food scraps that we want to add in, we'll put the food waste in, we'll cover it with brown material, And we'll continue doing that. And over time, we will need to turn the pile periodically. And mostly that's to ensure that all the food scraps has a chance to be fully broken down in the center of the pile. And you're also doing that to promote airflow. Um, and yeah, to make sure that the moisture isn't unbalanced throughout the pile. It's not too wet in one spot, too dry in another. The amount you turn the pile will really depend on, again, if you're using it for gardening, you may want to turn the pile a little bit more because the more you turn the pile, it will continue the process faster because you're constantly making sure that there's fresh material in the center to be broken down. But if you're just trying to build a compost pile to keep food waste out of trash, you could turn the pile like once every month or so and not even really think about it much, especially if you're layering your material because you're promoting air and moisture flow by doing that. And so, yeah, if you just pile things up and don't want to touch it and allow it to break down, that is absolutely fine too. Very low maintenance. Um, and then you do want to water the pile as needed. It should have the moisture amount like a wrung out sponge, where if you were to grab contents of the pile and squeeze it, a few drops of water would come out. And that would tell you that there's enough water that your bacteria isn't drying out because they're water loving. They need that water to survive because they live in like the film of water that is within the compost. But it also tells you that there's enough airflow if you get that wrung out sponge moisture level. And very quickly, and again, sorry for all the text on here. I guess this is my first text heavy one, which is good. I wanted to talk a little bit about the difference between cold compost and hot compost, because this I think is just important to understand as a general concept. In our backyard, often what we are doing is cold composting. We have a pile size that's under 1 cubic yard, so under 3 feet by 3 feet. You know, again, if you have a pallet bin and it's completely filled up, you're getting close to that hot compost size. But for the average home, you're going to be in that under 1 cubic yard. And with that size, we don't expect our temperature of our compost to get over 131 degrees. You may get into the 120s, but you might not get more than that. And you would expect to get a finished product in closer to 6 to 12 months. And really in Vermont, it's more like 12 months because we have such a long winter. But if you were to go someplace further south, you might be able to get a finished product in 6 months or so. And so cold compost does involve less maintenance. You can just build the pile and forget about it. But it does not kill weeds or disease suppression. So you do not want to put in any diseased plants, any, blighted tomatoes. Those need to stay out of your backyard compost because it does not get hot enough to suppress those diseases. And in the winter, cold compost systems will typically become inactive. Whereas in a hot compost pile, which is any system larger than 1 cubic yard, so that involves our commercial composting systems, a lot of on-farm composting windrows, aerated static piles, those, because they're so large, they do generate enough heat to reach over 131 degrees Fahrenheit. That heat helps to speed up the composting process, and you can get 3 to 4 months. But because of that sped up process, there is more maintenance needed, specifically turning the pile on more of like a thoughtful schedule based off of that temperature. And again, this is in like, compost facilities or like if you're really, really into it in your backyard. But you don't need to think this much about it. But when you do have a hot composting system, you can compost meat and bones, which is why when you drop off your food scraps at a local transfer station, You can include meat and bones in there because that is typically going to a system that has large windrows, will generate enough heat to break down that material, kill pathogens, kill weed seeds, and plant diseases. And these hot compost systems can even remain active in colder months. This is just a little graphic, again, sort of showing how when the compost pile heats up and is turned, it will release heat, release energy, and then the bacteria, will basically repopulate the pile, continue consuming the organic material, generate heat. Every time it's turned, it will release heat, and then over the course of the few months here, as the food is consumed in the compost, it will generate less heat after every turn. And that's how you know in the end you have a stable product, because there's not enough material in the compost to support all the bacteria. It's not generating heat. And again, this is more for hot compost systems. You wouldn't ever think about it like this in a backyard compost, but this is sort of what happens when, you feel like your compost is generating heat. After a while, maybe it's not anymore. You can turn the material, it'll feel like it's activating again. And so, yeah, just a visual of that. Troubleshooting really quickly. Mostly all of this text is to say that if your compost isn't breaking down, it's probably too small of a pile or doesn't have enough food scraps. And that isn't typically what a lot of people think about with troubleshooting. They think about, what do I do when there's an odor? So if you have an odor, something is wrong with your recipe. If it smells like ammonia, you'll have too much food scraps. If it smells like rotten eggs, there's not enough oxygen. And so depending on the type of scent might help you determine how to adjust your recipe. But having an odor isn't a sign that you failed. It's a sign to adjust your experiment. Think about the inputs. Think about what your desired outcome is. If it's really, just wet and smelly, my desired outcome is more airflow. I should add more carbon materials. And there are certainly resources online that will explain, help you decipher what odor it is and how to fix it. And so I don't want to spend too much time on it, but I just want to emphasize, when you're troubleshooting, that's when you're really getting into the experiment. And you're looking at it and thinking, how can I control this experiment in a way to get my desired outcomes? And so I know the odor is off-putting, but don't be off-put by it. Just try to think critically about your inputs and how to change it. So quickly, just going over composting in winter. Your compost pile will freeze for the most part. You can try to insulate it with bales of hay, and you can have ample browns to last through the winter. But really what you're doing is, if you're composting in the winter, is you're layering your pile, allowing it, which will freeze. And so it's going to freeze. It won't smell very much because it's frozen. And so animals hopefully won't get in there. But you're really sort of preparing yourself for the spring when it thaws. And then you have to pay attention to your moisture levels, turning the material. And so really composting in the winter is just, in my view, building a frozen pile and having the material just ready in there to thaw in the spring. And then really focusing on that maintenance in the beginning of the spring, like this time of year. Quickly, composting in pets. Just want to emphasize, your pet should not be left unattended near your compost piles. The fungus in the compost can produce what's called a tremorgenic mycotoxin, which is a powerful neurotoxin to dogs. And so if your pet ingests raw compost, seek veterinary treatment immediately. They will quite possibly need to have their stomach pumped out. It is not like a sentence, but they do need to seek veterinary treatment. Oh, and just yeah, quickly, some signs of that is they would be like salivating, they'd be falling over, they'd be lethargic. It would be quite visible that something is going. And so just some emerging issues that we're facing in the state are jumping worms. And this information here is mostly in recognizing that jumping worms are here, and we want to make sure that we know that our sources of feedstocks or our compost material is as clean as possible. And so a lot of times that means using leaf and yard waste from your own house and avoiding using leaf and mulch waste from offsite as much as possible. And then if you purchase compost, like bagged compost or bulk compost, there are ways to solarize it and to heat it up so that you can kill the jumping worm eggs and yeah, mostly the cocoons before you spread that compost onto your lawn. But again, the emphasis here for ways to avoid that in your own compost is using clean carbon materials, clean leaf and yard waste that you can say that you source from your property or somewhere else that you can assume that it's not infested with these worms. That being said, they are around. We don't want them to scare us from continuing our goals of being able to make compost and use it. And quickly, other options for managing food scraps. If you've listened to this and you're like, I'm not into it, compost is collected, food scraps are collected, including meat and bones, at a variety of locations across the state, every transfer station in Vermont. And then there's also some local community collections that exist. There are also different at-home options such as solar digesters. These are subterranean options, which are dug into the ground. You would not get a finished compost material from them, like you wouldn't harvest compost from it. The material digests into the soil. And so certainly the nutrients are going back into the soil, but it's largely driven by molds instead of bacteria, as I understand it. And we do have more resources both online. We have this book called The Dirt on Composting. It's really great. It goes into a lot of things, like all the topics I touched on today. And then every community in Vermont is part of a solid waste management entity that you can call up someone and ask these questions, ask if they have compost bins at cost, if they have any educational resources, just great experts all across the state. And now is a time for questions. So I think I went over. We still have, yeah, good. We have a little over 10 minutes for questions.
Yeah, we sure do. And do you want to stop sharing your screen and we can we can all see each other? I think we're a small enough group. If people want to share their cameras, you're welcome. And if not, that is equally fine. And we do have some questions and comments in chat. But Cody, I'm actually gonna see if I'm happy to read what you put in chat, but I also wanted to just invite you, if you wanted to unmute, feel free to, and we can start with you and maybe you can share some of the comments and questions you had.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep, perfectly.
Okay, awesome. Yeah, so I just had a question when you were going over sort of like building your own composter at home. Right now, we are working on trying to get more residents in Clinton County. I'm over in New York. We're trying to get some more of our residents to have some like at-home composting opportunities. So we've been promoting like the green solar cones, and like the little green buckets so that they can have like something in their kitchen for food scraps to be tossed in. Um, but we have a lot of renters in the area, so they aren't super keen on spending the time and energy and money into building something that's a little more difficult to move around with them. Um, so I wasn't sure if you had any suggestions for getting their buy-in. Earlier in the week, we had a presenter who was discussing keeping things like super hands-on to get their buy-in a little greater, to keep them more interested. And I think it kind of reduces that barrier to like, can I actually do this?
Mhm.
And like that difficulty level that they're afraid of. And then an additional barrier that we're experiencing is we only have one hauler in the county that does residential pickup for food scraps. And she's very passionate. She's working with some of our schools too. She wants to reach out to more people, but um, it's just a lot to have one hauler for every resident in the county.
Yeah,
Um, so
absolutely. Yeah, because I mean, I think there is a reality to the fact that there are some people who will choose not to backyard compost for whatever reason. Um, and so, as much as I would like to think that, you know, people with certain motivation or information would be interested in it, there's just so many things tugging at people's attention that there certainly has to be a solution for those that decide that that doesn't work well for them. And so that's where having a hauler and having um, the bins, like you mentioned, that you are providing to the tenants and having that in-house disposal option for separating it in the kitchen is so key. And then, getting the motivation to compost, I haven't actually found a solution for that in a tenant setting. And I think a lot of that, unfortunately, a lot of that structure needs to come from the property management and just seeing um, how they can engage their tenants. There needs to be some type of leader that I personally, and this is not my professional opinion because I haven't engaged that much with tenants. But certainly, I think it needs to have a leader. It needs to have just a point person who claims that responsibility, that can see the project through, um, that can help educate people about it. And so it can't, I don't think it would work as just a one off thing. Like, um, you provide the buckets, you provide the information, and then without that support, there, it, something. And yeah, I guess what I'll say is it's just really difficult. And so I personally don't have many answers. And certainly like decreasing the barriers by providing funding for the bins is huge. And so whether or not that is on the county level or the municipal level or funding coming through the state, um, I've just seen it in my own time that if you can offer a bin at cost, um, it helps significantly. And so the soil saver design, like I mentioned, I have experience with selling those through a district and felt like that was a design that helped decrease barriers for people because it's so sturdy and rugged. Uh, but yeah, I'm sorry, I don't have like much more encouraging information to share for renters. And I will say in Vermont, only about 30% of our population is in multifamily housing. And so it's absolutely something that I know personally I want to figure out how to address more is how do we reach those residents? How do we reach that 30% of people who live in that multifamily housing? Like the situation, the places where I grew up, I always grew up in the 3-story tenant building. Like how, like, yeah, how do you get people to change behavior? It's a it's a question I'll
right.
always be
Like
asking.
I have 8 garbage cans outside my apartment and they just get filled so fast, and I guarantee most of it is food scraps that people are throwing away.
Yeah.
But like my stepmom, I grew up having her, she had like a compost pile. So like I learned what could go into the compost, but then I never like really got into it myself. So this is interesting, kind of getting this role at the health department here. Um, but yeah, we are waiting on some funding from the New York State DEC for a grant that we had received. So once we get that, hopefully we can purchase some like solar cones for municipalities to offer to the residents, either free of charge or supplemented to some degree. But yeah. And then I just have
Mm.
one other question. When you were
Mhm.
discussing like the backyard composting and being careful with your pets to make sure they don't get into it, How soon do those symptoms like set in? Do you know?
Yeah, I do believe it is almost immediately. And I just know this from an instance of someone reaching out to me in my former position to share with me anecdotally what happened with her, that she was out in her yard with her dog. And about half an hour later, when they were in the house, the symptoms started, the panting, the drooling, the starting to fall over. And then they just become so lethargic. It's very clear that something is wrong. So yeah, it is something that should be addressed immediately, and you'll start to see the symptoms pretty soon after the compost is ingested. And I will say, these fungal strains that are in the compost are also fungus that exists on moldy bread, in leaf litter on the forest floor, but like we don't feed our dogs moldy bread. We don't They don't typically eat leaf litter from the forest floor, but it's that compost, it's those additional scents that draw them
Mhm.
to that. And so these funguses aren't solely in our compost; they are occurring in nature and other places. Yeah, I just wanted to point that out.
Okay, awesome. Thank
Yeah.
you. I appreciate it.
Yeah. Rhonda, I know you had a couple comments, but just pulling on the thread of convincing folks to get engaged, I thought I'd invite you to sort of continue that sort of thread of conversation.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting just working for a solid waste district. We've had, since the law in Vermont has gone into effect to keep food out of the trash, especially just seems to be Essex Junction is a huge one. Burlington a little bit, Winooski a little bit, but Essex Junction, where I currently live, seems to be like, oh, that just drew in all of the rats, and we had this overrun thing. And now I have a community garden where we compost nothing, not even our garden waste, because Essex is so concerned about this whole rat thing, which I'm not saying it's not a concern, but I was wondering if you, Shannon, or anybody on here had any uh suggestions on how to calm down this whole like rat infestation thing. I mean, the way I look at it is like the rats didn't come in for the food scraps, they were already there. They're just coming in because it's like easier food. But I mean, I might be a little off on that as well.
No,
I
I mean
just
there's a lot
you
to say to
experience
that. I
that.
mean, the rats are there. Like we do recognize that rats are in Vermont, maybe more, certainly more than what we would expect. And I often heard of, people calling them like river rats. And so I have this perception that they follow stream corridors, and they live in the woods. And so it's like I personally don't know as much about their habitat and stuff like that, but they do exist. And so we recognize that compost piles not only are a food source, but they're a source of shelter as well. And so you sort of have like a double issue with it. That being said, there are resources to mitigate that. Like New York City has a bunch of resources about, mitigating rats. Like they worked with I believe, the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, and created some great infographics. Um, I feel like I shouldn't say this, but I'm going to say it because Paul Tomasi in the Northeast Kingdom Waste Management District, he would always say a great tool is also something called predator pee. It's not something that we have researched at a state level, and so I'm not, this is all just anecdotal, but there are even synthetic urines that you can purchase to keep wildlife of certain types away. And so I know from a place called Carne Choling in Barnet, Vermont, they had rat issues. They purchased predator pee. They were able to mitigate those rat issues. They had windrow composting. And so again, and there's also the possibility of using some type of in vessel to keep the material rodent proof, for those first initial stages of composting. And so, yeah, rats exist. We do not want to feed them. But certainly there are ways that even large urban areas have been able to manage their facilities and keep rats away. And it does understand, that rats, they want shelter, they want food, they're going to find it wherever they can. But that is unfortunate that the town, I mean, it's really interesting because there's other communities that I've heard have had some rat issues, and the town health officer is like, what do we do? And so, in a sense, it's like, good, there's concern, but we don't want that to be a barrier. Yeah.
Yeah, I'll just give a plug for ILSR. They have, I forget, they have a clever name. It's not Rat University, but it's something like that. But anyway, it's a whole webinar for community groups on what attracts them, how to prevent them, how to manage it. And I'll see if I can find the link and throw it in as a resource when I post this recording. But if you want it sooner, you can also just go to ILSR's website and I'm sure find it. But it's really good and it's very thorough and it has a lot of those materials. And I think, again, like Shannon said, it's really a matter of helping people not completely freak out and understanding that there are pretty simple things groups can do to prevent it from becoming an issue. And I will just say, from working with some groups in Essex, there's like a weird rat population in Essex. This is like a recurring thing. And so some community groups have more gumption in tackling it than others, in my experience, because there has to be that follow through. Like I've gone to consult with some of these groups, and like it's like, here is what, but if you don't have that follow through, you don't have that, you're gonna still have the issue. So it is right at 7:30. We had a couple other questions in chat, but I think maybe we should call it, and then we can also just answer. Shannon, I can share the chat questions with you. And
I did just put my email in chat as well. And so certainly if people want to continue this conversation, I'm more than happy to share some digital resources, like I mentioned, get you in contact with your local waste management and entity. Just I love talking about compost. And so again, I appreciate being here. Thank you so much, Natasha, and everyone for sharing part of your Wednesday evening with me. I hope you'll look at your compost with a slightly different viewpoint now and just know it's all about the microorganisms and making them happy.
yeah, thank you so much, Shannon. Thank you to all the participants for taking time out of your Wednesday evening.